No, I think the most noticeable thing about how YouTube has changed over the years, especially since about 2020, is how a lot of the avant-garde, a lot of the YouTubers with an alternative view of the world, kind of just since vanished. They're just gone now. They're not here anymore. And with that, there's just no sense of community, and there's no real kind of intellectual vanguard anymore. It's just like a kind of empty space, a deafening silence. It used to be that you had small, kind of organic communities online, and they were built up on YouTube with like tools like Google Hangout, subscriber lists you could have a look at, and you could, like, if you were inclined, you could network off of that, or like me, you just sort of like lurk and keep an eye out for the most interesting characters, most profound ideas, and a lot of that since really it's just kind of mostly been eliminated, or at least heavily censored now. It's not there anymore, and kind of any interesting scene for the most part has been sort of uprooted and just tossed asunder. It just doesn't survive anymore. And if any of it does, it's like on the far out reaches of like, the mystical nether regions of like Odyssey or D Live or God knows where. And so on YouTube, at least, you compared to what it used to be, you're just sort of left with this yawning chasm. Like it's just like a void. It used to feel like it was alive. It was alive with creativity, with ideas, with people. And don't get me wrong, you have all that now still, but it's like life in the sense of like ivy growing amongst the ruins. It's like it's not what it was. The glory days are gone, and you still get new and interesting YouTubers pop up sporadically, but they're now kind of subject to, and this is a difference, like controlled algorithmic forces that they have to abide by to kind of get any traction anywhere. And I think it has this sort of dulling effect. And I'll expand more on that in a later video. I think I've got ideas about that. But in any case, there are a few remaining YouTubers that have braved, like they're still here, they've braved the electronic winds of chaos and entropy over the last several years, and are still somewhat active. And arguably the last most notable figure of like the old guard is Morgoth. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with, of the eponymous Morgothsreviews channel. I think I remember him remarking in a video once that he was like the last of the eagles, like a grand saber-toothed cat who was about to get hunted by some toothless goon and just skinned and hung up on display to be mocked and jeered at. Which is a very sobering remark, because I think for a lot of YouTubers that's what's happened. That's come true largely. I mean, everyone else got demonetized, deplatformed, censored, but Morgoth kind of survived, but left almost completely alone in the YouTube wilderness. The last remaining few. Something else interesting happened afterwards, and that's that Morgoth kind of voluntarily sort of began to turn away from YouTube. I think, like his own choice. I mean, I only found out very recently. I think he was sort of doxxed by a media state-sponsored hate group. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. So I think a kind of part of his sort of turning away, as it were, was somewhat informed by what happened to him recently, and the instability that would have caused and ensued. But I also I do get the impression quite strongly that the kind of this, like his own sort of turning away, at least in part, because he's still on YouTube, he still does make videos, just not in the volume that he used to. It's a kind of, I don't know, I'd almost characterize it as a kind of like sort of tiredness. I think it's like a sort of lethargy it's sort of in everybody to a certain extent. And just to qualify this idea of like a great turning away, it's a phrase coined previously by Morgoth in an older video that he made, and it's a general kind of descriptive of this idea of just normal people sort of turning away, like a collective turning away from the mainstream narrative, like a sort of like switching off effect. They're not engaged as much anymore. I would almost see it as just a kind of like atomization to an extent. I think it's just a part of the entropic forces that we're being plagued by just in the modern world in general. And I think Morgoth himself is to an extent subject to these kind of forces. I mean, YouTube, the platform he displays his art and his video ship, it's like the spirit, the soul of the thing. The collective unconscious is being pacified, controlled, picked apart, and shepherded almost algorithmically, in a direction that is only ultimately beneficial to our masters. It's this idea. It's like you've seen The Shining, where the protagonist isn't haunted by ghosts, as in your sort of stereotypical like horror flick. It's the house itself that's haunting them, and in I guess a sort of a different kind of way, YouTube as a platform has effectively turned against its own creators, its own audience, and declared a kind of like a spiritual warfare on everyone. Like the house you live in is haunted. Like the platform YouTube is against you. It has a kind of malevolent desire to control you and to scare you and ultimately to own you, to own how you think. And like what? Do you see the world differently? Well, you see what happens to people that think differently. We can destroy them. We can take all their hard work and demolish them, throw them into a digital exile, deplatform them. Like in the case of being removed from Twitter, it's being described as being removed from the public square. It's almost a human right to be on it. So the platform itself is the system demon. Relating this, going back to Morgoth, I felt his work was alive, like it was organic. It has personal meaning. He's able to infuse his own experiences deftly into his essay-like style of video ship, and his work. It makes it very relatable. It makes it ultimately just very human. And on a platform like modern day YouTube, it's a miracle it survived as long as it has. I mean, the vultures start to swoop, and ultimately you're not going to make thoughtful, sensitive content if the system is programmed to target you and to destroy you. I mean, and spit out your bones for a baying mob of idiots who just, want to see you go down for entertainment. Now, Morgoth has himself, as I've mentioned, qualified this great turning away idea and characterized it, if I remember rightly, as a kind of apathy. People are just kind of tired of the constant dopamine fix, addiction cycle. But I also feel there's this other very kind of pervasive element of YouTube and just mainstream social media in general it is malevolent. And I think there's an almost like on a subliminal level, regular nice people react in an adverse fashion to it without even realizing. They turn the other way, they leave, they turn away. They find another digital home, somewhere more palatable. In the case of Morgoth, I think Woes as well, like on Substack, which it's like a kind of subscription-based blogosphere. And I think that's great. And I think it's obviously an accommodating platform somewhat to outsider views. It lends itself well to the intellectualism aspect of the kind of the essay style of Morgoth. But I think in a larger sense, whilst it's like a nice little home for outsiders, it's a greater kind of shame that talent has to almost sort of like self-silo itself, away from the mainstream. They don't even have to deplatform you outright. They can just create and kind of foment a kind of febrile, sort of degenerating atmosphere all around you. And you lose all hope and you just leave for another home. And most importantly, as a result of that, we've ceded. We've symbolically lost in a way if our voices are no longer heard or have the opportunity to be heard by everyone on mainstream platforms anymore. Because let's face it, most people have never heard of Substack or Rumble. I mean, never mind singularly go to visit them to watch their favorite outsider former YouTuber in semi-imposed exile, right? They're not going to do it. Think of like, just reminds me of like Stefan Molyneux, for example. It's never been the same. They get memory hold effectively, and that's just again another just modern Orwellian term that we just use casually nowadays. And just to stress, none of this is all to paint Morgoth in a negatively at all. I mean, I think he's great. I think he's one of the best of us. And in any case, people like us are going to have to be comfortable with at least having one foot on the outside looking inwards. In one way or another, we are in exile, or soon to be. But it's just a shame, you don't see him as much, or people like him anymore, where it matters most. You almost just wish that he had a kind of dramatic ending with a brave last stand fighting against big media. Deserves to go out with a bang and a rowdy, veritable Viking send-off in the North Sea. But it's not. It's just like a kind of slow, sort of darkly fading into the shadows, like ultimately all of us are. It's like falling into the recesses of our own collective, collective consciousness, partly crafted by the algorithmic forces of our enemies and our opponents, just forcing us into places, siloing us off into oblivion. And that really, in a way, symbolizes the fate, the final chapter of the alternative right. It's like the last light's fading, and in cases nowadays by one's own choice, just because there's just no sense of, well, there's a reason to go on, which I guess is a bit depressing, but it just is what it is, I guess. I just hope that Morgoth himself can keep growing and influencing the mainstream in whatever small way that he can, and that from the shadows he's able to cast a somewhat illuminating light in a darkness for people that need it the most. And hopefully going forward, new light from that can start to be sparked again. It has a kind of like a domino effect, hopefully. And from there, who knows? We could light the whole world on fire with our spirit and our ideas in a way that would make even Prometheus jealous. Maybe, but I'll leave you with that dramatic ending. So I'll see you in the next vid coming soon.